Well, hello everyone. Good morning if you're here in Gidea Park or in our part of the world. And hello if you're who knows where and who knows when, because hopefully this talk, these set of talks, is going to be heard by a lot of people online. In Britain at the moment, we are painfully halfway through what they called a snap election. 6 weeks of preparation, they call it a snap election. I'd rather do the Macron way, which is just a month. But I want to compliment everyone who's here, because you've actually not got fed up with thinking about elections and social justice and all those kind of things. And you've come to listen to a speaker who's very distinguished. We're very lucky to have you, Raymond. I mean that. To talk to us about Catholic social teaching. Now, those words might be new to you, or they might be very familiar. But I think, to me, they say, for the last 150 years, there's been a kind of intensity in the Catholic Church being concerned about the state of society and societies and wanting to do something about it. But it didn't start then. You go back to the Hebrew Scriptures, you go back to the Acts of the Apostles and the Gospel of Jesus, and you find that there it is, social justice. What do we do about the people with whom we share our lives? Now, Raymond has got a very distinguished CV, but I'll just give you the last bit, which is he is CEO of Caritas Social Action Network, which is an agency of the Bishops' Conference in England and Wales. And so he's well into the topic that he's going to be talking about today. I need to say something also about his book, which is Catholic Social Teaching and Introduction, which comes from Redemptorist Publications and is recently published and reviewed in the Pastoral Review. If you want to get a cheapo copy, it's cheap enough as it goes, isn't it? I mean,
think so.
Complimented
reasonable.
Pastoral Review for being so affordable. I think $12.95.
$11.95.
$11.95. You can get an additional £2 off if you use the code. The codes are available there on the counter. So go online, find this book, use the code, and you'll be delighted. Okay, we're going to have a session now for about an hour. Then we'll have time for lunch, and then we'll come back afterwards. So I won't waste any more of our time, and I want you just to welcome, please. Raymond's travelled 3 hours to get here, so thank you so much for coming. We look forward to listening to you.
Thank you, Father Adrian, for the warm welcome. It's good to be with you. Father Adrian contacted me several months ago and asked would I be interested in talking about Catholic social teaching in an election year. At that time, we didn't know there was going to be an election when I came here. Or maybe Father Adrian knew. I don't know. I'm not suggesting he put bets on the date or anything untoward like that, but it so happens that here we are, as Father Adrian said, now in the middle of a general election campaign. So I'm not going to go straight into talking about the election. That'll come a little bit later. I thought I'd start with talking about Catholic social teaching, which might give us some of the principles that might help us to reflect and discern on how we might use our vote. So we'll start that way for the first set. Is that okay? I've called it Catholic social teaching a refresh. Now, I might be taking something for granted there, because any Catholic audience I speak to, there's a wide range of people for whom Catholic social teaching is a complete mystery. They've never heard of it, or they've just about heard of it, or they're somewhat familiar with it. There's a kind of cliche that it's the church's best kept secret. Have you heard that one? Catholic social teaching. It's a bit of a tiresome phrase, actually, because I think we're moving slowly but surely, and especially in the pontificate of Pope Francis. I think we're certainly moving to a different place. Just about everything I read from Pope Francis refers to the principles of Catholic social teaching. He doesn't always use the phrase, but it's there in everything he talks about. And indeed, Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul. I mean, it's not just Pope Francis. So I hope is becoming a bit more known and widespread, because it's not an exotic bolt-on. It's not something that just progressive lefties talk about. The popes tell us this is mainstream Catholicism. It's a mainstream part of our faith. It's the faith looking at society and the social order and what looks like something that resembles the kingdom of God. So that's what we're talking about. So to get us started, I thought I would begin with something personal rather than going straight into something abstract. I thought we'd start with something personal. And we've already met some fellow Scots in the room, so this might have resonance for you. This is a photograph of me beginning my Catholic education. It's one of those photographs that turns up when you're sitting up with mum, looking at the photographs, as in actual photographs that are in a biscuit tin or a photograph album, you know, not photographs that live in the cloud, but real photographs, you know, and you're looking through them. My mum's now gone to God, but this is a few years ago. And we're looking through all photographs, and there's Auntie so-and-so and Uncle so-and-so from Donegal and all the reminiscences that go with it. And this photograph appeared. I said, Mum, what's that? She said, that's you in your first week in primary school. Don't you remember? I said, well, not really, but I'll take your word for it. So this is my class in St. Lawrence's Catholic Primary School in Greenock. Greenock, anyone from Greenock or near Greenock? Greenock is on the Clyde coast, near Glasgow, on the River Clyde. A place that used to build ships. Remember we used to build things in this country? A place that used to build ships and other things. So this Catholic primary school was right down on the riverfront. Behind the school was a road and then the shipyards. So we could literally hear the sound of ships being made when we were in school. This photograph was, well, can I tell you where I am to put you out of your misery? So the trouble is we all look the same, don't we? Because it's kind of, you know, we've all got kind of these Beatles kind of fringes, and the boys look like the girls, and, you know. But anyway, so this is me. Right down here. That cheeky, chubby little chappy right there. And I'm sort of, it's a bit of an awe, isn't it? Awe. And some, you know, body language is a funny thing, because some gestures never leave you in life. And to this day, I still default to this is my defensive posture. So if I end up standing in front of you like this, you know that I'm feeling very insecure. But anyway, this was me. If I tell you when this was taken, perhaps one of you might have the good grace to sound surprised. Because it helps my fragile ego, particularly after the destruction of Scotland last night in the football. So this was taken in August, because remember, in Scotland, we don't really have summer in Scotland. So school starts in August. So this is August 1967. Oh, okay, thank you. That was an effort to sound surprised. Okay, thank you. And I'm using this just to give us a way in to think about the Catholicism we grew up with. And in a moment, I'm just going to ask, because I love to hear people sharing and talking. In other words, I'm not going to talk at you for the next 3 hours, you'll be pleased to hear. Because I think now it's only respectful, and we talk now about synodality, which is about listening and sharing. And I think the church is becoming much better at listening to each other. So in a minute, I'm going to ask you the question, what kind of Catholicism did you grow up with? Now, I'm aware, of course, that you might not have grown up with Catholicism. You may be a convert, you might not have had any religion, you might have had a different religion. But if it's not Catholicism you grew up with, then what religion did you grow up with, or what perception of religion did you grow up with? So that's coming soon, okay? So just hold on to the question. So this is me in 1967, west coast of Scotland, east end of Greenock. So this is a working class Catholic community. And reflecting on this, because most of my professional life's been in education, Catholic education. And I look back on that, and I can see now, the way I didn't see at the time, that Catholic education started in the East End. Why do you think Catholic education started in the East End? Who's in the East End?
East End of London.
East End of London, East End of Greenock, East End of Glasgow. The East End.
Poor area.
The poor. The East End was the poor. Often, since the middle of the 19th century, the Irish poor were living in the East End of our industrial towns and cities without much of an education. So when the hierarchy in this country returned in 1850, what's the first thing they did? They built schools. They built schools, not churches. The churches would come. They built schools. Why did they build schools? To give these kids the dignity of an education. So the East End poor, that was the priority of the church, to give these kids an education. And perhaps some of us, I certainly benefited from this. I was the first one in my family to go to university a few years after that. And so I've now become a sort of middle-class person by education, having started off as a little working-class runt from Greenock. I've had an education, and I'm able to contribute to society in a different way. So that was the Catholicism I grew up with. Was the school, the family, the church. Those three great pillars of formation. Now, I think we can get a little bit nostalgic about that, and I'm not going to. Because I think, oh, Catholic school, you're so lucky when you're a Catholic home, you went to a Catholic parish. Yes, and it was great. But actually what we do now in our Catholic schools, I think, is much more inventive, actually, and creative than what happened then. Because I think what happened then was kind of, a lot was taken for granted. It was kind of by osmosis. Do you know what I mean by that? It was, a lot was taken for granted. Whereas now I think we're much more intentional about our formation. So I was in a Catholic school. I went to Catholic church. I was an altar boy, of course. I had a sense, in my Catholicism, looking back, there was something about getting to heaven. That seemed to be the priority. Now, please God, we get to heaven, don't get me wrong. But that seemed to be the priority. Get to heaven. Jesus did something heroic for us. We were told to behave and get to heaven. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong. That was the emphasis. That for me, looking back, get to heaven. If you behaved yourself and died without horrible stains in your soul, you'd get to heaven. That's what stays with me. That's what stays with me. Now, was your experience like that? Can I just give you 2 minutes? Now, this might be a personal question, so you can retreat from it if you want and make it as personal as you want. It's entirely up to yourself. But with your neighbour, or if you want to fight, their father's very kindly giving you a neighbour to talk. With your neighbour, perhaps 2 minutes, just a snippet. What kind of Catholicism did you grow up with? Or, if it wasn't Catholicism, what kind of religion did you grow up with? Do you want to have a little go? Just 2 minutes. A very short discussion. So just a snippet, really, something you might want to continue later. And apologies, I should have welcomed anyone watching on the live stream. You're very welcome to join us. And if you want to contribute to this, please put any comments in the chat, and Paul will feed them back to us. So thank you for that. Does anyone want to share anything about there, please?
Totally, shall I stand up? Will that be
If you wish, yeah.
I identify with everything you've said, every single thing. I am Eastender, born in Stratford, in St Francis Parish. Myself and my brother were the first people to go to university in our family, small family. We were materially poor, but we always got what we needed, always. But we were culturally and spiritually rich. And every day I bless my parents for giving us that. You know, they hadn't been educated. You know, my dad was clever, died of industrial disease when I was 16, and people like us didn't prosecute.
Interest, yeah.
If you were a criminal, but they had this vision, if you like. So, and the thing that you said about osmosis, completely identified with.
Thank you. Yeah. A lot that resonates with me, what you just said. Thank you. Anything else to share about the kind of Catholicism you grew up with? Any thoughts, insights, agreements, disagreement? Agreement. What?
Well, it's just the same. We have to be older than you.
Yeah.
But everything you said is exactly how
It
I
made
remember.
it.
Family, rosary.
Yeah.
Being an altar boy.
Yeah.
We know what you're going to say next. Oh, we think we do.
Watch this space. Watch this space. Any other thoughts before we move on? Yeah, please. Then we'll come.
Well, I remember going to Mass and not understanding any of it because it was all in Latin.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yeah. I mean, I think I was kind of on the hinge of that because that was 1967, and I was like, well, I went to school early because that's a long story, but I was like 4.5 there. And my only real memory of Mass was in English, but my parents, of course, their memory was Latin, and very much like yourselves, not understanding it and using that Mum had a missal full of little prayer cards and devotions and would say the rosary during Mass, you know, because what was going on really didn't make much sense. But, thank you. Yes, please.
I come from a different background. My background is Methodism. And the story I know of is that when the Europeans came to West Africa, when they called it Gold Coast, the kings and the chiefs, they called them that, were quite impressed with the way the Europeans had education and all that. So one of the kings said to the missionaries, said that we want your religion and we want your education. And so the chiefs provided land for them to build schools and churches. And that town is still a town, it's called Cape Coast. And that became the center of education in Ghana for many years. So yeah, education was opening the door for faith as well. That's how I grew up.
Well, it's great to have that perspective. Thank you, and how we were seeing education and religion together. Thank you. But I think yes, please. Is that okay? Anything else? Yeah, was there another?
I'm not sure. I think it was more social, and it was to keep you on the straight and narrow, and it was a Catholic straight and narrow.
Yeah.
And that was in school as well as the family life and local. Can't remember talking about heaven much.
I agree with what you just said. I remember some wag once said, on a different take to the beginning of John's Gospel, said Catholicism then could be phrased as following: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was no. No. They keep you on the straight and narrow. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we're happy to. Is that okay? Just to give it a sense of, just to warm to our theme. So let's see if Father Adrian knows what I'm going to talk about. I don't think the question we asked much was, what is a just society? Now, it's interesting because people were asking that question. I mean, when I was growing up here in Greenock in the East End, and we'll kind of weave references to politics as we go through. I mean, my parents, my father, were Labour supporters. They voted Labour all their lives. And there was no tension for them between voting Labour and Catholicism. And a lot of them were Labour, Catholic, and Union people. You know, in the shipyards and in the factories, they were in the unions because the unions were important. So the unions and the Labour movement always placed an emphasis on education. So going right back to those early days of the Labour Party, what's the first thing you did? You learned to read and write and form an argument. Because up to then, it was only the powerful ones had the education. So learning to read was really important. So in the shipyards, in the union meetings, they asked the question, what is a just society? But I don't think in the sort of mainstream church, that kind of discourse was going on. I don't think so. But I want us to move us into that theme. It was talked about, of course, in the church for hundreds of years. We're talking about justice and a just society. And I just want to begin with a definition from Pope Benedict XVI, which really picks up from more tradition, I think, more than scripture, and picks up from a tradition of people like Thomas Aquinas, the great medieval saint and teacher. And Benedict XVI said that building a just social order, so there we go, we're right at the heart of what we're about, a just social order, wherein each person receives what is his or her due. That's a key word. What is his or her due is an essential task which each generation must take up anew. So right there, the key word there, I think, is due. What is due to each person? What is due to each person? I think that's at the heart of it. And if we go then back to Vatican II, and Gaudium et Spes. And when we look at Catholic social teaching, I'll show you a lovely list later on of all the key documents in Catholic social teaching for your homework. There's quite a long list. But I would suggest, and again, I'm slightly nervous in this company because I'm not a canon lawyer and I'm not a scripture scholar, and I'm going to talk about both. But I believe that the Vatican II is the highest teaching authority in the church. And I always pause there, just waiting for somebody to throw something at me. And I think I'm okay. Phew. So I've survived another one. Because it's an ecumenical council. It's all the bishops of the church with cum petro, sub petro, teaching, you know. This is the church. So Vatican II, I think, is quite important. Although some people in the church, maybe not so much in this country, I don't know, are trying to undermine and diminish Vatican II. But for me, it's a constant inspiration. And for Catholic social teaching, I think Gaudium et Spes is for me the inspiration, is the one that speaks most about Catholic social teaching. So here we find teaching about what is due a person. And Gaudium et Spes says there's a growing awareness of the exalted dignity proper to the human person. And that word, that concept of dignity gets bigger and bigger and louder as we go through Catholic social teaching. The dignity of the human person is at the heart of Catholic social teaching. And when we see our list of encyclicals, we start with, in 1891, with Pope Leo XIII. Dignity is mentioned, I think, 3 times in Rerum Novarum. But by the time we get to Gaudium et Spes, it's about 50 times. That's just a word count, but it's indicative of how important it is. So because of that dignity, since they stand above all things and their rights and duties are universal and inviolable, therefore, there must be made available to all people everything necessary for leading a truly human life. So the church isn't talking about heaven only, but a truly human life. And it goes on, and it's too long a quote to put it all up there, but it talks about what's necessary for a truly human life. It talks about food, clothing, shelter, education, respect. And you might think, well, that's not religious. But it's the church saying we want human beings in this life to lead a truly human life. In other words, it's not that kind of, the Marxist cliche that, religion is the opium of the people. So you can suffer in this life, okay? The capitalists want you to suffer in this life, but you've got heaven to look forward to. So no matter how bad it gets in this life, don't worry, you've got heaven. Does that ring a bell? I mean, it still resonates with me, that kind of message. But the church says, no, that's not good enough. God wants his children to prosper in this life and be happy with him in the next. Just to echo the catechism. And before Vatican II, John the 23rd gives an even longer list in his wonderful encyclical Pacem in Terris in 1961. It's sometimes called the Catholic Charter of Human Rights. It's paragraph after paragraph. He talks about what is due to the human being, their rights and what is due to him. Because he goes on and he talks about, as well as all these things, he talks about medical care. He talks about social services. Social services to protect the dignity. This is church teaching in John the 23rd. So Gaudium et Spes talking about food and clothing and shelter. There was a time not that long ago when he said, well, food's, yeah, we take that for granted. Everybody's got food. Everyone's got shelter. That's maybe referring to other places where they're really poor. Is it? And now we've got a situation in this country. If you look up the Trussell Trust, which is one of the biggest providers of food banks in the country, the Trussell Trust tells us that in the past 12 months, 3.1 million emergency food parcels were distributed by food banks. 3.1 million in the last 12 months. And in the last 12 months, or from April 23 to March 24, 650,000 people used a food bank for the first time. 650,000 people used a food bank for the first time. They did not have enough income to cover their essentials like heating and food. They had to go to a food bank and say, can you give us food, please? I can't afford to buy it myself. Can you imagine the feeling I've got for the first time going in there and saying, could you give me food? That's in this country, one of the richest countries in the world. So that a truly human life is being denied to these people because they don't have enough for their basic needs. So that is an injustice. That is not, they're not getting what is their due. And just a quick word about Caritas, because that's the organisation I currently work for, Caritas Social Action Network. This is the Caritas Internationalis. And I didn't know, I spent a lot of my life as a teacher. I was a head teacher in a Catholic school. I didn't know about Caritas. I knew about CAFOD, great stuff, overseas international development. I didn't know about Caritas. Now, I think that is something that is gaining ground, thankfully, in this country. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the Caritas International, their vision, look at the phrase they use, a just world. That's the first thing they go for. A just world, transformed to reflect God's kingdom. So God's kingdom is about justice and human beings flourishing in this life as well as the next, where all people in our common home experience the love, compassion, and fullness of life. I like that as a vision statement. It's short and it really gets to the point. So that's the international vision. Caritas Social Action Network, agency of the Bishops' Conference, as Father Adrian said. We are a small team, and we convene 52 charities are members of CSAN, Caritas Social Action Network. And one of those members, I'm pleased to say, is Caritas Brentwood. And it's great that Father Dominic's here and all the work he's done to support it over the years. So if you haven't made contact with Caritas Brentwood, could I urge you to do that, please? Has anyone made contact with Caritas Brentwood? Is that, yeah, great. So I would urge you to do that. Now, I know, again, it's a growing team, it's a small team. Wonderful person called Shan is leading it up. Great energy and youth there. So please make contact with Caritas Brentwood, because this is the church's pastoral instrument for advancing a just and society. So that's just some of our framing to give us the concept of justice. I now want to go into two different perspectives by way of introduction. I want to talk about a biblical perspective and then a historical perspective. Is that okay? So the first one, I want to start here with a biblical perspective. When you talk about Catholic social teaching, some people say, well, let's talk about dignity. Let's talk about the principles. Let's talk about Rerum Novarum in 1890. That's great stuff, and we should get there. But I like to go back to something called Scripture, because I think it's there in Scripture. And I think it's there at the beginning of Scripture. This event, which has been described in this 19th century painting, was a horrendous siege of a city called Jerusalem in the 6th century. It was about 587, I think, BC. And the mighty neighbouring empire of Babylon came in, besieged the city, starved them into submission, and then their tactic in those days, once the city had fallen, and it really did fall, apparently archaeologists have discovered what they call a destruction layer. There's actually a layer of ash they've discovered when everything, including the temple, was burnt to the ground. They really did trash these places. Does that sound familiar? And I won't go to other places right now. So this is Jerusalem being absolutely trashed in 587. And their tactic was to deport not everybody, but they deported the kind of top tier of society. So they deported the aristocrats, the priests, the scribes, the civil servants, and they took them away to Babylon, 800 miles. An 800-mile walk through desert terrain from Jerusalem to Babylon, and there we sat down and wept. So they took them and they deported them. And some scholars, and this is when I look nervously at Father Adrian for hopefully affirmation. I know it won't tell me off in public, I know that. But some scholars, I think, believe that from this group of exiles, particularly priests, a priestly group of exiles, they encountered in Babylon accounts of creation called creation myths, which were quite violent. There's one I like to read called the Enuma Elish. It's a Babylonian creation myth. The world is created in violence, gods fighting violently with each other, blood being spilled, human beings being born out of the guts of dragons. It's all very horrible and violent. And human beings are born as slaves to the gods. That's the vision of creation in the Babylonian myth. This group of exiled people who thought that God had abandoned them because they were supposed to be the chosen one. They're 800 miles away in captivity in Babylon, reading these myths of creation. We already had the account of Adam and Eve, that was earlier. They write another account of creation, which we now call Genesis chapter 1. And that remarkable piece of scripture, that remarkable inspired text, remember it begins, let there be light. So we're not talking about dragons killing each other. God says, let there be light. It's creative. It's beautiful. It's generative. And part of that text is God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them and he blessed them. And later on, he said, you're good. This is quite a different vision of being human compared to the Babylonians. Humankind, so I know I said mankind there. Humankind in his image of God. And that can become quite an abstract term. I think, having read some of the work that's come out of Rome and the wonderful commission there, the word image, the image of God, I mean, it's like a statue. And the image of the emperor, it was put into a town when the emperor wasn't there to remind people of the presence of the emperor. So we are made in the image of God as representatives of God on earth. We are made to be like God. And male and female, he created them, are made to be in community, not solitary. So all these messages we're getting out of Genesis 1. If image of God becomes a bit abstract, which it can do, there's a wonderful definition by, do you know that Thomas Merton, the mystic, the Catholic mystic? He talks about image of God, or imago Dei in the Latin. To say I'm made in the image of God is to say that love is the reason for my existence. For God is love. Love is my true identity. Selflessness is my true self. If we're made in the image of God, it means we're made to be loving, to be with God, to have choice, to be creative. That's our identity. That's our vocation. Is selflessness. Love is my true character. Love is my name. Does that make more sense than the image of God? I hope they both make sense, but I like Thomas Merton's, the way he expresses it. Now, things didn't go according to plan. So God had a vision for humanity to live in harmony, to enjoy the fruits of the earth, to live in holiness, to live in justice. And we have something we call in our tradition the fall. And sin entered the world, as we know. We know the story of Adam and Eve. And sin entered the world. And I think, well, what does sin mean? What does original sin mean? And one of the best definitions I found recently is from Pope Francis. He's written a wonderful little book called Let Us Dream. Have you come across that? If you haven't, I would urge you to have a look. Let Us Dream, it's called. And he talks about sin in these terms. And I think it helps us into Catholic social teaching. He says, our sin lies in failing to recognize value, in wanting to possess and exploit that which we do not value as gift. Notice those words, possess and exploit. Sin always has this same root of possessiveness, of enrichment at the expense of other people and creation itself. Possessiveness. It's that grasping. You know, in the story of Adam, it's that grasping of the apple. It's that grasping of that which we should not grasp. Because God said, look, there are limits to being a human being. Don't cross these limits. But we grasped. We crossed the limits. And that's our downfall, our selfishness. So the sin is in exploiting that which must not be exploited, in extracting wealth, power, or satisfaction from where it should not be taken. So whether that's extracting wealth from the earth, or possessing and extracting value from another person, that is sin. Does that make sense? Does that resonate with you? So that helps me understanding original sin. This is our inclination to be selfish, to possess, to extract value where it should not be taken from. And the countervailing force to that, of course, is God's grace, trying to raise us up. So that's the way I see it. So sin is a rejection of the limits that love requires. A rejection of the limit that love requires. So when sin comes into the world, violence spreads through creation. We see that in the Old Testament. And injustice follows. We see that in Israel, once it's been rescued from slavery and settled in the land of Canaan, the land of milk and honey. Injustice enters the land, I think, around about the time of the monarchy, because a monarchy needs taxation. A monarchy needs to raise a lot of money. And once you start to raise a lot of money, you start to exploit people, and people get poorer. And once monarchy gets going, they start to give land to their friends. So if there was ever a vision of people in Israel with their own little plot of land, subsistence farmers, then monarchy starts to give land to other people as gifts, and for favours, and to keep them in the court and so on. So they're joining field to field. Remember that bit in Isaiah? Joining field to field. In other words, taking land from peasant subsistence farmers, giving it to rich people, creating a class of poor people. That's really important. Poverty is not natural. Poverty is something which is contrived and it is created. And of course, when there is poverty and injustice, God raises up prophets to speak against injustice and poverty. And the great tradition of the Old Testament, the prophets speak out against injustice. And one of my favorite examples is Isaiah. And this is the beginning of the book of Isaiah. I mean, we talk about 3 different phases of Isaiah. So this is Isaiah 1. This is early Isaiah, which is probably, I don't know, the 8th century, maybe BC, when that injustice was really starting to affect people. This is the beginning of the prophet Isaiah. Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, remove the evil of your doings from before my eyes. Why? Cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. It's that classic formulation of look after the vulnerable ones, the stranger, the orphan, the widow in your land. So God raises up, stirs a vocation, and people like Isaiah to say to the power, stop it. Cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice. I think rescue the oppressed also has the kind of meaning of rebuke the oppressor. Rebuke the oppressor, apparently is in the Hebrew as well. Defend the orphan and plead for the widow. To seek justice. So when Jesus comes on the scene, and I just want to look briefly at the beginning of his ministry. When he arrives in Nazareth at the beginning of his ministry, he goes to his hometown in Nazareth. Remember, he's been baptized. He knows who he is. He knows he's beloved of God. We've had the temptations in the wilderness. He knows what his ministry is not. I'm not going to be a leader like the powerful ones. I'm rejecting all that. And he comes to Nazareth. He stands up in the synagogue. He opens the scroll of the prophet Isaiah and he says, this is what I'm about. This is my mission. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to do what? Here are 5 things. What's the first thing he says? This is God made flesh speaking to us about his mission on earth. Good news to the poor. That's the first thing he says. Good news to the poor. Release to the captives. Recovery of sight to the blind. Let the oppressed go free. Proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. Now, we could spend quite a bit of time, I think, just on this because it's such a rich text. But a couple of things maybe to draw out. One is good news to the poor. Now, of course, Luke is writing in Greek, isn't he? All right, so poor, and I'm not a Greek scholar by any means, but the poor, the Greek word used is something like tokos, which means literally kind of cowering, kind of bent over. So it's not just down in your luck. It means these are the ones that are really kind of bent over, crushed, destitute, if you like. We might use the word. So this really is the very poor. Okay, and we sometimes say, well, the Gospel talks about the poor in spirit. Well, it does. But I don't think that's what Luke's saying. He's talking about the poor, the actual poor, the tokos, the cowering ones. Jesus is reading from Isaiah 61. But he edits Isaiah 61. Now, somebody says, Luke's doing the editing. Well, actually, some scholars are saying, actually, there's very good supporting evidence to say that Jesus is editing 61. He brings in a line from Isaiah 58, which is, let the oppressed go free. Doesn't belong in Isaiah chapter 61. It belongs in Isaiah chapter 58. He brings in this line. Why? To make the point, I think, that he is talking about social justice. as well as liberation from sin. So in other words, going back to the picture, going back to our shared Catholicism for many of us, it was very much about salvation was what? Salvation was liberation from sin. Yes, absolutely. But I think the church increasingly is telling us it's liberation from sin and all oppressive and unjust social circumstances. And that's rooted in Scripture. Let the oppressed go free. Jesus is really making a point here. The oppressed are the broken ones. Let them go free. Anyone who's tied down by injustice should be freed. And here, to proclaim the year of Lord's favour, of course, is a reference to Jubilee every 50 years in the Old Testament. The slaves were released, debts were cancelled, the land was given a break, from our working of it. It was a year of restoring just relationships, of resetting the social and economic order so that the creditors didn't get it all their own way. Can you imagine a world in which the creditors were controlled and the debtors got a bit of a break? I mean, we've gone just mad the other way. The creditors get it all their own way, and the debtors are the ones that end up in deep, deep trouble and destitution very often. And here, Jesus did a really interesting thing, because to proclaim the year of Lord's favour, the next bit of the verse in Isaiah 61 is, and the year of vengeance of the Lord. He doesn't say that. Jesus stops, he chops the verse. He stops at that point. The year of the Lord's favour, yes, and the vengeance of the Lord, no. Now, is that why in this episode the crowd turn against him? Because remember how this finishes. It doesn't end well, do you remember? They take him up to the brow of the hill and they want to throw him over and kill him. Why does it suddenly go so horribly wrong? Well, some suggestion is, obviously, when he talks about examples of the faith later, they're Gentiles. He talks about the Syrian general, he talks about the widow, and that maybe enrages them. The examples of faith are from the Gentile community. But it maybe starts here. He's saying this community was looking for vengeance on the Gentiles, and it wanted to take over the land of the Gentiles that lived among them. And Jesus says, no, there is no vengeance to be talked about. There's no vengeance in God. Liberation, yes. Vengeance, no. Does that make sense? Okay. So the message here is one of liberation to the poor, release to captives, recovery of sight to the blind. There is a rhetorical pattern here. The English teacher in me loves this stuff, because there's a rhetorical pattern, a sort of chiastic pattern apparently. When 1 echoes 5, 2 echoes 4, and in the middle, giving it prominence, is recovery of sight to the blind. You might think, well, that's at the heart of the gospel message, which is compassion. Deep compassion for humanity is at the heart of the gospel message. Is that okay? Is that making sense? So don't worry, this is linked to Catholic social teaching because it's about liberation it's about human flourishing in this life. That's the important point. And Jesus goes on, of course, not just talking about the poor, but we get this remarkable moment in Matthew 25 when Jesus identifies himself intimately with the poor, to the extent he says, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was, you know the passage, it's very well known to us. I was thirsty, I was a stranger, I was naked, I was sick, I was in prison. And all those people who cannot realize their own dignity. They're in prison, they're sick, they're thirsty, they're strangers. They have no resources to call upon. They have no influence. They are the tokos. And Jesus doesn't just say, I love them. Jesus says, that's where you'll find me. And that passage right from the beginning, the early fathers of the church, that was a major passage for them in their inspiration. That's converted so many people. And that kind of gospel message has introduced something revolutionary into human history. That's why in Christianity we opened orphanages and hospitals and schools and looked after the sick, because in these most vulnerable ones you find me. That's the point. Truly, just as you did it to one of the least of these, you did it to me. And the final point, before a little bit more discussion, is about the cross and salvation. Again, I'm quite happy to be corrected on this, but I am quoting from the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church. Now, have you heard of that one? Most people haven't. That's okay. I hadn't till I started this job. The Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church. I didn't bring a copy along. It's a bit of a doorstopper, but the first 100 pages is quite inspiring. I mean, as an introduction to Catholic social teaching, it is well worth your time, I would suggest. It's from the Vatican. It's like the Compendium of the Catechism. It's a summary of Catholic social teaching. It was published in 2004. So it's, you know, it's from the Vatican. It's got the stamp of teaching authority of the Church. And this helped me, because when I look at the cross of Jesus and the crucifixion and resurrection, again, in my childhood, the cross was something, this bloody mess on Good Friday. Jesus did something heroic for us, and then I had to behave to get to heaven. Now, the Church, I think, is trying to lead us to a richer understanding of that. I mean, it says God in Christ redeems not only the individual person, which is what I was brought up with. Jesus died for me to get me to heaven, but also the social relations existing between men and women. The social relations existing between men and women. In other words, on the cross, I would suggest original sin that we talked about, which is the violence, the injustice of the human condition, is simultaneously revealed by Jesus. Jesus is killed by violence and injustice, and simultaneously revealed and forgiven. Does that make any sense? So Jesus on the cross reveals original sin and forgives original sin. Original sin being the unjust relations and violence between people. Is that okay? Yeah, kind of. Yeah. So it's about relationships. God's vision for humanity is relational. There's a wonderful moment in Gaudium at Spes when it talks about the Father's where's it gone? The Father's will for humanity. This is Gaudium at Spes 24. God, who's got a concern for everyone, wants all people to be one family and behave to each other as brothers and sisters. God's will for humanity is relational. He wants humanity to live as one family, as brothers and sisters, in peace and justice and harmony. Yeah? And original sin is a distortion of that vision, a distortion of those relationships. And on the cross, Jesus redeems that injustice and says, peace be with you in the upper room. This injustice doesn't kill me. That's the resurrection, resurrected by the power of God. And in the upper room says, peace be with you. And then go out now, go out and be ambassadors for this peace and reconciliation. Does that make sense? So let the oppressed go free becomes something which we are supposed to do. With the Spirit of God in us, the Spirit of forgiveness, we are sent forth to bring that peace and reconciliation to everybody. And to try and make this a bit more vivid, this is an example of a moment in my life which I'll never forget. When I was in Manila, and I was there with a group of head teachers, and we were hosted by the wonderful community of Benedictine nuns in St. Scholastica's College. And they were showing us around Manila, the different places, the different social projects they run. The whole college, by the way, from kindergarten, as they called it, right through to what we would call year 13, was saturated in social justice. The whole curriculum. They were educating middle class and upper class girls because the only Catholic schools in Manila were fee paying because the government didn't support Catholic schools. The only way you could get a Catholic school was if it was fee paying. But they did so much to make sure that education was provided for as many poor girls as possible. It was a girls' school. And make sure that those girls who would leave there and they would be in the corporate towers of downtown Manila, that they had a conscience and they had a heart for the vulnerable when they got there. So we're walking around and say, we're going to visit the cemetery today. Okay, why are we visiting the cemetery? See, because in the cemetery, you'll find the poorest of the poor. In Manila, the poorest of they lived in the cemetery. So this was the old style colonial cemetery, from Spanish influence. So you got the wall, the niche graves in the wall. You got the canopies and the graves. And we walk, and sure enough, it was just full of families living in these canopies. A little string of washing, little t-shirts up to dry, a little stove, cooking up something to eat. Groups of people just drinking pink liquid from plastic bottles just to escape from this reality. It was a whole community living here, the poorest of the poor. And then I always ask myself, well, where's the church? Where's the church here? And I didn't have to wait long before I found the church. Because we're walking around, we heard singing. We heard children's voices singing. And we came across this scene in this canopy here. There's 2 women from the local parish with a group of children. What's going on in that scene? What are they doing? Teaching. They're teaching them. There's no iPads. There's no smart boards. There's no books. There's no pens. There's no nothing. But they're teaching them. How on earth do you teach without a Chromebook and an iPad? How are they teaching them? Singing. How did Jesus teach us? Jesus didn't have an iPad, did he? Or a smart board. How did Jesus teach us? Parables. And he told us stories, sayings, deeds. They're teaching them songs, memorable little rappy little songs about how inhaling glue is bad for you. How to avoid exploitation of gangs, how basic hygiene, how a little startup in business might work. They're teaching them songs of liberation. Let the oppressed go free. They're trying to give them a pathway out of this circumstance where they are tied down by poverty and injustice. Does that make sense? Does that make it? So there's the church doing what the church is asked to do, which is lead people out of this oppression. Now, the people that are doing that, of course, it starts with them. This isn't a social enterprise. This isn't an NGO. It starts with their conversion of heart, because if the Spirit is upon them, that's what they want to do out of love. Yeah, it's always justice and love is the primary motivator here. So it's their conversion of heart motivates them to be this loving witness. But they're not just teaching them how to say prayers to get to heaven. We want to get you out of here, and we're trying to give you pathways out of here. Does that make sense? So as another little buzz, I'm way over time already, but just for another minute or two, can you think of an example in your community where the church is actively letting the oppressed go free? It might not be as dramatic as that, but a little project where it's working with, I won't give you the answers. I don't know the answers in this community. But where is the church active in your community working for social justice or compassion? So we get some examples. So we bring it home. Does that make sense? Yeah? A minute? Have a little go. Have a go. Any examples of where is the church working in your community?
Brentford. Yeah. Still no maybe
Times I'm in the hurries a little bit. Going over in a little bit, just warning you. So if you can just bear with me for 10 minutes, is that okay? Just stretch a little bit. Any examples of which is active in the world involved in, please? Do I just say a bit more about how this links to what we're talking about?
I think that we support CAFOD, in many ways.
Yeah. So we're just talking about a CAFOD and supporting CAFOD. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just trying to work out where we were talking about that just now.
Yeah.
Saying how much the different parishes support different charities that are around. We work with the SVP as well. Yeah. Supporting people. Well, we just say that we're oppressed.
Yeah.
I mean, those justice really for different people.
So CAFOD and the SVT, two great examples of church bodies, church. Yeah. Thank you.
Do quite a lot of work all over the world, not just in the parish.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. And Father?
This only works at the Marillac, and so that in itself is an example of Catholic social teaching providing palliative care, really dignity for those who might otherwise not find it. Yeah. So that's significant. But us in Romford, so I was very struck at the start, you raised that link of the Catholic Church with the working poor through the work, through just the life of the East Ends, wherever, which city. And as I've been reflecting on that through the morning, I fear part of the issue for our church in the UK is we've kind of lost that link, really, structurally. It's there sometimes, and it is there, if it's anywhere, it's through schools, perhaps more than anything. So for us in there's a local charity, Smile, and I think their reach into the poorer parts of our community is greater than ours would be. So we've enabled them to do their work. Yeah. And that's, I hope, is something about answering that question.
Yeah, it's helpful, and of course it doesn't always have to be a Catholic charity. We can work with other people of goodwill, and it's great to see someone from Marillac, because you're part of the Daughters of Charity Services.
Correct. That came from, as I say, in Ireland. In France. It started with a need for nursing and social care. Yeah. And it came out to England. So that's centuries ago. But so that's where it comes from. St. Vincent de Paul. Yeah. Society.
It's a wonderful. It's a wonderful. Because I know the Daughters of Charity Services, the umbrella group, they're members of CSAN, and of course this weekend, tomorrow being the Day for Life, is a wonderful moment to celebrate the great work you do, providing dignity for the dying. I mean, wonderful. Thank you. Paul, please.
On the joining together aspect of what you just mentioned, in Ilford, which is my local parish, we have an ecumenical project called Project Malachi, which has developed from the night shelter over winter for the homeless, in which we were all involved. And it's a set of demountable bedsits, if you like, which are tenable for about a year, so that people can go from street sleeping to a more ordered way of life, what we call ordered way of life, so that they might then be able to support themselves afterwards. But that includes Christians, Muslims, Sikhs, no faith, but it is quite well known and is therefore good publicity that it's a sad thing that the Catholics weren't at the front. We were on the coattails of the Salvation Army, but we were there, and so it's a good example, I think, of what can be achieved.
It's a great example. It's a great example of restoring dignity, isn't it, to people? And actually, it's a good point, Paul, because the Catholic Church is not always the front of the queue. I think Pope Francis said about the great movement to end slavery. I mean, was Wilberforce, was he a Methodist? Yeah. I mean, it wasn't the Catholics that were in the forefront of ending slavery. We get there, we get there eventually, but we're not always in the front of the queue.
That's what people see. They don't see the book on Catholic social teaching. They see the action or lack of it that Catholics sometimes present.
Yeah.
And that tension is where the problem lies.
Yeah.
Is the theory is great.
Yeah.
But the actual living out.
You've got to, yeah.
Yeah.
Is the key thing. Was there a, please, and then Father.
Just going to say that Catholic Women's League nationally at the moment are supporting PACT. So lots of ladies making little crosses to put in the pocket with a little prayer inside to give to prisoners, and producing bags to give people that come out of prison that have nothing. So it's just to give them basic things like some underwear, socks, to write with, and things like that, just to give them a bag to take out with them.
It's a wonderful charity. PACT is our Catholic, works with people in prison and their families. And that's key, isn't it? Because the figures that tell us that people in prison who've got contact with their families are much less likely to reoffend. So PACT does a lot of work making sure that people who are in prison stay in touch with their families. Really powerful stuff. And it's right back to Matthew 20. I was in prison, you visited me. Brilliant. Father Adrian?
Well, the oppressed in the present moment, politically, refugees. So next Sunday we've got Jesuit refugee service coming.
Great.
We're having protests which say we're on the side of refugees.
Yeah.
And people will come to the Catholic parish here and they'll see 3 posters saying that, and they'll think, are we? Because we've been indoctrinated into being anti-refugee.
Yeah.
The other group is Muslims. We're indoctrinated we're just naturally anti-Muslim because that's what our society tells us we should be.
Yeah.
And then the oppression which is inside every person. The gospel says you don't have to be oppressed because at the very least God loves you and your brothers and sisters. So the whole Christian message is chipping away at the oppression that we're all victims of.
Yeah, great, thank you. That's a lovely reminder that next week is Refugee Week.
Oh, good.
So,
the right time.
so that's not that's a so-called secular celebration. But again, we at Caritas, these are people of goodwill doing good things to celebrate the contribution of refugees to this country. So we are very much involved in that. Very much involved in that. And the Jesuit Refugee Service do incredible things. So thank you for that. Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm also involved in the Unbound Ministry team, which is a deliverance prayer ministry. So you said inner oppression. We're dealing very much with setting people free of all sorts of things. Well, the Lord does that. But it comes from the United States in Laudato, but that just rings a bell, oppression, and I've seen through prayer ministry people set free too.
Right, I wasn't familiar with Unbound Ministries.
Unbound.
Oh, thank you. I wasn't familiar.
In Laudato.
Yeah.
It's been presented to the Vatican recently, and they're discussing in conversation with them to bring it more to the ordinary, just counter.
Great, and I love our connections about inner oppression and liberation, because that's the liberation from sin, or we might say anxiety, or that's our liberation. To trust God, trust the Holy Spirit, trust that we are forgiven, and we don't have to be bound down by our past, or whatever it is that binds us down. I know it's a lot more than that in terms of there's real trauma and real psychological oppression, which is quite different. But it's good to make that connection between that liberation. Anything else? Was there another? Are we happy with that? So should we just finish off where we started with the East End? I'll do that quickly. We'll finish at the East End because it's not far from here. Does anyone remember this picture? I'd be a bit concerned if you did. This was 1889. So I'm not suggesting any of you are that old. But this is the East End of where? East End of London. And what's the event? It's the dockers. And why the dockers striking? Because they're not getting enough. They're not getting paid enough. They only get. No, well, you're on it. They only get paid when they work. They only get paid when a ship's in. So imagine a room this size with 200 men. And the foreman comes in and says, we've got 3 ships today, so work, the rest of you, off you go. No work, no pay. What do we call that now? 0 hours contract. It's the same principle. It's 0 hours contract. I was talking to a group in Glasgow earlier this year about this, and a woman came up to me and said, my dad was a docker in Govan in the 1950s. And she said, if the door went at 10 o'clock, we knew there was no work that day, no pay that day. So it took a while for everything to really flow through in terms of just working conditions. But the docker said, enough, enough. We can't live like this. Our families are living in slums. We don't get enough to eat. We cannot live like this. So the one weapon they had, if you like, was their labour. So they withdrew their labour, and the owners were mortified. It's like, you're ours. You can't do this. So there was no concept of negotiating with the dockers. So there's an impasse. The dockers, 100,000 dockers marched to the East End. And there's a great sense of solidarity. And actually the middle class people helped set up soup kitchens. Why? Because they marched with dignity. They made their case, they made their speeches, there was no, trouble. But they withdrawn their labour. And food and money came in from labour movements all over the world to support them. And into this impasse came, tell us, Cardinal Manning, who's best known probably in a lot of our minds for his work in education. But Cardinal Manning, who was highborn, I mean, he was privileged, he was wealthy, therefore the owners got him. He sounds a bit like us. We can trust this guy. The dockers, who are mostly Irish, also got him. Why? Because he was a bishop, he's a prince of the church. He's one of ours. He was ideally placed to be in the middle and arbitrate. And what the owners didn't count on was how strong he would be when he talked about what was going on. Because the owner said, this is a private affair. Look, these are ours. Just buy out everybody. And he said, the capitalist is invulnerable in his wealth. He thinks he can act with impunity. There's a wide field of misery caused by their refusal to negotiate in this strike. It's not a private affair. It's a public evil. It's a public evil. And they were like, my God, the church didn't talk like this for a lot of the 19th century. I mean, the leadership of the church. Because too often, and there's good, maybe historical reasons, we were terrified by the French Revolution, which was a major, traumatic event for the church. So we did, I think, tend to side with, at least at leadership level, with the establishment, the powerful ones, the owners. The church didn't speak like this for most of the 19th century. And now Manning, it's like, my God, as if the church found its prophetic voice again. Now, of course, the church has got, diplomatic offices all over the world. So, Rome is in London as well. It's like, oh, this is interesting. What's going on here? So reports are going back to Rome. Who's in Rome? Leo XIII. 2 years later, what does he produce? The first, what we call social encyclical. So it's a letter of the Pope, but it's a social encyclical. And it's the beginning of what we call the modern era of Catholic social teaching. And it's called Rerum Novarum, which is just the Latin titles. We love our Latin, don't we, in the church? It's just the beginning of the text. It's the first 2 words of the Latin text. So it's of new things. The new thing Leo XIII is talking about, of course, is capitalism and the industrialization and the enslavement of people to capital. And look at the language again. A very small number of very rich, and does this sound familiar? A very small number of very rich men have been able to lay upon the teeming masses of the labouring poor a yoke little better than that of slavery. And again, the owners are like, what is he saying? The Catholic Church shouldn't talk like this. This was the language that Pope Leo XIII used. Because boys and girls were not in school, but boys and girls were down mines, in factories. And that's perhaps a little bit sexist because the girls were down mines. The boys were in factories. They were being brutalized. They were being dehumanized for the profit of a few people who lived where? In the West End. Yeah. In the West End, where the nice sandstone houses were. Yeah. And to this day in Greenock, my hometown, the West End is full of lovely sandstone villas and mansions, and the East End was where all the slums and tenements were. Why? Because the prevailing winds, when all the muck came out of the factories, the prevailing winds took them over the East End. So if you live in the West End, you got all the nice fresh air. If you live in the East End, all the muck was blown your way, okay? So again, it's right down to injustice. So from that moment in time, 1891, there came this wonderful river of teaching from 1891 all the way down to 2020, Fratelli Tutti by Pope Francis, of Catholic social teaching. And it's a wonderful body of work. And I do keep going back to Gaudium et Spes. So again, if anything comes of this, a little study group on Gaudium et Spes, would be a great gift, I think, to any deanery, any parish. And actually, because we love a good anniversary in the church, don't we? 2025 is what? The 60th anniversary of Gaudium et Spes. And what else is it? It's the year of Jubilee. So Jubilee, Gaudium et Spes, let the oppressed go free. There could be a little something there developing, couldn't there? I think that'd be rather wonderful. So again, if you're reading the signs of the time, I would always say, begin with where the church is reading the signs of the times most recently, because there are some people in the church that's like, well, they can't see beyond John Paul II, for example. He was my pope. This was the high watermark of Catholic social teaching was Centesimus Annus in 1991. That's when John Paul II said that capitalism had won. No, he didn't. No, he didn't. But there are people in the church that use Catholic social teaching for their own agendas, to say that this was the papal blessing on capitalism. No, it wasn't. Catholic social teaching does not subscribe to capitalism, the unfettered market, nor does it subscribe to collectivism. It's something else. It doesn't subscribe to extremes, and that's important. So I'll finish with all this teaching. There's a remarkable coherence of principles. So from all this teaching emerge 4 permanent principles of Catholic social teaching. Now, if you're in a school or an office and you've got the CAFOD poster and you've got, 10 principles, or it's not wrong. We're not talking about how many people in the Blessed Trinity here. It's not the doctrine of the church, but it's an organization. So the Compendium talks about 4 permanent principles. And I'll finish with this, then we'll have a well-earned break. So this is my one-stop shop, my little tree. Okay? I should put a credit on here because the tree was actually drawn by my wife. So it's not my work. So thanks to Janet for doing the tree. But I just try to put it on one place that made sense. So God is love. That's what nurtures us. The universe is a loving place created by a loving God that wants his creatures to flourish. So God is love. Jesus is the love of God made flesh, who walked with us. And the Holy Spirit is the love of God among us and in us. That's my take on the Trinity, having thought about it recently. So the foundational principle is dignity, the dignity of the person, made in the image of God, made in love and for love. The common good, which we'll talk about a little bit more after lunch, the common good is the conditions that allow everybody to flourish and live truly human lives. Everybody. And this is the difference between Catholic social teaching and, say, libertarianism or utilitarianism, where it's about me or it's about most people. The church says everybody deserves a dignified life. That's the common good. Solidarity is we're all responsible for all, not just in our neighbourhood, but all over the world now. Francis has expanded our gaze to a global perspective with care for a common home. And subsidiarity, I won't have much time to go into it, that's, well, where are the decisions made? How is local life thriving? How is civil society thriving? Those little groups where we come into our maturity, where we celebrate, where we learn how to live with each other, where we participate. That's subsidiarity. And then we've got a little snake here. Look, you see our little snake? What's a little snake? That's temptation. That's we're back in the Genesis 2 and 3. That's original sin. Pope Benedict says the serpent isn't the devil, by the way. That's another story. But we know that there is an evil at work in the world. We know that. So the preferential option for the poor we'll come on to next. Care for creation will probably, if the compendium is rewritten, and I think it is being rewritten, I suspect that care for a common home will become a fifth permanent principle. I'll have a word with Father Adrian and see if you get any inside track on that. But I think it's been rewritten. And I think that'll be out because it's so important. This was 20 years ago, these 4 principles. I think now care for a common is so urgent that it will be, I'm sure, a permanent principle. Right. I think you deserve a wee break. You've been very good and lovely and attentive and friendly. Shall we have a break, Father?
1 o'clock.
Yeah, shall we break?
Yep.
Fresh air, some lunch. Hope you remember to bring your lunch.
Yep.
Yep. So, right, let's pause there and we'll see you back here at 1. Yeah, perfect. All right, see you at 1 o'clock. Don't go away. Thank you. Great, and recording. Okay, super. The other principle, just to mention, is the preferential love for the poor. And again, that's I like to remind people this is in the Catechism as well, because there's still a little lingering suspicion that the preferential love for the poor is somehow a little bit left wing, a little bit liberation theology. Not really. It's pretty much mainstream. It's in the Catechism, and it's expressed very powerfully in the Catechism that those who are oppressed, there's the language again, in the Catechism, those who are oppressed by poverty are the object of a preferential love on the part of the Church, which, since our origin, and in spite of the failings of many of our members, this is quite honest, has not ceased to work for their relief, defence, and liberation. Relief, defence, and liberation. And I think in that formula, relief, defence, and liberation, we can see the same ideas we're talking about in Luke 4. Let the oppressed go free, proclaim the good news. So it's relief, defence, and liberation. And it's a point just to make before we go any further, I didn't quite emphasise enough in the first talk, is I think Catholic social teaching is trying to shift the dial from compassion to compassion and justice. In other words, the gospel begins with compassion but doesn't end there. The gospel begins with compassion, but then love insists on justice. I think that's the point. And often in the church, again, the church of my childhood, there's a great emphasis on compassion, on relief of suffering, but not always on challenging the causes of it. And I think increasingly since the council, since the mid part of the last century, we've had that focus again on, of course, compassion, of course, relieving suffering, but also challenging the reasons for suffering, challenging the causes of poverty. That's very much part of our Catholic social teaching. So, with those principles in mind, when it comes to let's talk about voting. Should we vote at all? I think the church says something about that. I got very distressed. I heard somebody, I won't say who, in the church recently say, "Oh, they're all the same, this lot. I wouldn't bother voting at all. Nothing's going to change." And my head was in my hands. I thought, that's not church teaching. So for the record, let's go back to Gaudium et Spes, Vatican II, highest teaching authority of the church. All, not just Catholics, all citizens should therefore be mindful of their right and duty. Quite strong. Their right and duty to use their free vote to further the common good.
Can I just share my mantra at the moment? I think I have a moral duty to vote. I have a moral duty, therefore, to vote ethically. And in order to vote ethically, I need to inform my conscience. How do I inform my conscience? by reading documents like Gaudium and Spes and so on. And if I don't do that, my mantra as a teacher was always, it was from Albert Camus' The Plague, the greatest evil in the world is ignorance. The greatest ignorance is one that thinks it knows everything. There can be no true goodness nor true love without the utmost clear-sightedness. How do I get back clear-sightedness? I inform myself.
Yeah, no, I think that's very well said. I agree with that. And we'll come on to talk about clear-sightedness in a minute, because what does it mean to inform ourselves? So we've got the common good. So what is that? We'll come on to that in a minute. And what does that mean? We'll come back to that in a minute. But just in terms of encouraging all citizens, but let's just say all Catholics, because that's our work in Caritas. Our current campaign is register to vote. This is our Caritas campaign at the moment. Is register to vote, and we've emailed all the parishes in England and Wales. We said, please encourage your congregations to register to vote. In 2019, at the general election, 15 million people didn't vote. I'll show you the figures in a minute. So at this phase of the general election, we're saying register to vote, because you've got to register, and use your vote for the common good. And the deadline, so this weekend is the last chance to reach our congregations, at least on a Sunday, and encourage them to register to vote, especially our young people. You know, our schools and colleges, because the current year 13, most of them will have turned 18 because it's a July election. And a lot of schools are very much saying to young people, please register, get your ID, because you need ID these days to vote, and use it. So that's next Tuesday is the deadline to register to vote. So the figures themselves, this is just the proportion of people that did vote. So if you're a little bit further away, I'll give you a second just to orientate yourself. So there's England at the top. The lighter bar is the general election 2010. Down to the darkest bar is the general election 2019. That's when Boris Johnson was elected Prime Minister. So it goes from 65%, this is the percentage of those who voted. So 65% in 2010 through to 67.5% voted in 2019. You think, well, that's quite a high turnout compared to some local elections, but it does mean that 15 million people didn't vote. So that's part of our campaign. Before we talk about anything else, is register to vote, use your vote. Yeah, so those, and of course within that, I mean, there's the data is very interesting. Within that, younger people are less likely to vote than older people, and people in places in the north are often less likely to vote than people in places in the south. The demographics are very interesting. So we're trying to say to our young people, to people in constituents up north, please register to vote. So let's go back to the common good. Now, one document, again, we've talked about Gaudium et Spes, we've talked about Vatican II. Another document I think is really powerful and well worth your attention is a document from our bishops, the bishops of England and Wales, published in 1996, called The Common Good. It's still valid, it's still the teaching of our bishops. And it's one of those, it's a very interesting story of the document itself. Every bishop signed up to every line. It was a unified document and proclamation of the bishops. And it's really good. It's really powerful. So their definition of the common good, which expands the Vatican II definition a little bit, is that common good is the whole network of social conditions which enable human individuals and groups to flourish and live, again, here's that phrase, a fully, genuinely human life, known as integral human development. That's what we started with, that integral human development. All are responsible for all, collectively at the level of society or nation, not only as individuals. So that's their definition. So it's the social conditions. Like, I've been reflecting on this quite a bit. Now, the social conditions, one, I think, mistake is to sit back and say the state will provide all the social conditions for human flourishing. The state should provide the conditions for social flourishing. The church says that's the role of the state. But we as well, in our communities, we can contribute to the social conditions to help human flourishing in our work, not just our charity work and our big organizational work, but every moment of encounter and kindness, every gesture to someone in our community, in our parish, who's on their own, who's struggling, who's in debt, who's just lost a job. Every gesture of kindness and compassion is creating the social conditions where people can flourish. So we must remember the whole gamut of the common good is from every gesture we make right through to what the state provides. Now, let's go to Pope Francis. He talks a lot about the common good in Laudato Si. This is a little bit long, so there's not many more long quotations, but this one from Laudato Si is interesting because he links immediately the common good and the preferential option for the poor. When he says, in the present conditions of global society, where injustices abound and growing numbers of people are deprived of basic human rights and considered expendable, the principle of the common good immediately becomes, logically and inevitably, a summons to solidarity and a preferential option for the poorest of our brothers and sisters. Because if you say the common good is the flourishing of everybody, then it means that we start with the option for the poor. Where are the people on the margins of society who are most destitute, who are furthest away from human flourishing? That's where we have to start. So for him, there's a very clear connection between common good and preferential option for the poor. And another principle, which I didn't mention so much in part one, this option entails recognizing the implications of, and here it doesn't trip off the tongue, the universal destination of the world's goods. What does that mean? The universal destination of the world's goods. This is again core Catholic teaching, which says that, and it's not just Vatican II, this goes right back to the fathers of the church, that the goods of the earth are available for everybody. Everybody has a right to a share in the goods of the earth they need for human flourishing. So water, food, clothing, the goods of the earth should be available for all. And this is a primary right. Again, I don't think we've got enough confidence as a church to talk about this because it's too scary. This right is more important than the right to property. This is the primary right. The universal destination of the world's goods is more important than the right to property. The right to property is a secondary right compared to this. Why do we not talk about that? Because it's too scary. It's too dangerous, isn't it? I've heard very few people from the pulpit talking about this. Partly because, with due respect to our clergy here, most clergy aren't formed in Catholic social teaching at seminary. The clergy I talk to say, we never heard of this stuff in seminary. We didn't do it. And a lot of priests, it takes a while for them to kind of catch up with it. And then Pope Francis expands our horizon even further by saying the common good is linked to the state of the climate. He says the climate is a common good. The air we breathe is a common good. And then he goes on, and this makes me uncomfortable. He says an obsessive consumerist lifestyle undermines the common good because it harms the climate and does damage to people in other parts of the world who contribute least to that damage. Does that make sense? And when I heard that, I thought, I don't want to hear that. I think I live a fairly honest life, a decent life. I thought, well, do I examine my habits, my energy consumption, where my clothes are made? Do I really pay enough attention to that? I don't think I do. Pope Francis makes me feel uncomfortable, just like Jesus does. Because he just invites you to look in your conscience and say, how are you living? If everyone on earth lived like Europeans, it would take 3 planets to service our need for energy materials. If everyone on earth lived like Europeans, it would take 3 planets to service our use of energy materials. Now, that figure is much higher from America, but that Europeans, okay? In other words, we can live like this, I say this, I mean, you know, our average. We can live at this because most of the world can't. We can live at this because our lifestyle cannot be universalized. Does that make sense? If everybody consumed the same amount of fuel, energy, materials, meat, etc. that we did, the earth would collapse. It couldn't do it. And this is the great gift, I think, of Pope Francis in Laudato Si in 2015. He took Catholic social teaching and he introduced it to climate justice. Very powerfully. Very powerfully. So it's not just a case of, you know, recycling plastic and, you know, yes, it is, but the reason for that is because the gospel says we don't need all this stuff. So it's not just about being a climate warrior, it's about being a Christian. And, you know, especially in Luke's gospel, Jesus says, you know, but don't worry about this stuff, you don't need all this stuff. And Pope Francis links our consumption to hardness of heart to damage that happens in other parts of the world. Does that make sense? Yeah. So this for me is very powerful. This is Catholic social teaching is not set in stone. It expands and develops because it's responding to the signs of the times. So 1891, Leo XIII wasn't talking about climate because we didn't have the science and understanding at the time to know what was going on. Even though a lot of damage, the factories were chucking up lots of damage, greenhouse gases were well underway, we didn't know that then. Now there's no excuse. We know the science, we know the damage, and the common good is not just about this community or this country, it's about this world. And that I find very, very, very powerful. So I think that has to be part of our thinking as well. So, how do Catholics vote? Or how have they voted? Or do Catholics vote as Catholics? I was talking to a journalist yesterday who was trying to trick me with all sorts of funny questions. It's a tricky one. But so here's data. So this isn't speculation, this is data, okay? So the colours more or less work. So the top line, this is the Labour vote of Catholics. That's the percentage of the Catholic population in Britain that have voted. The top line is Labour, the middle line is Conservative, and the bottom line is Liberal, becoming Liberal Democrats in about 82 or whatever. So here's the 1959, it goes up to 2010, this one. So the red line at the top, so you can see a kind of peak there in about the mid-60s when most of the Catholic population voted Labour. And that's the cultural context I was talking about. My background in Greenock, East End of Greenock, my parents voted Labour. I mean, they did say at the time, you could run a donkey with a red scarf and it'd be elected. It was just Labour, Labour, Labour. You know, that's why in Scotland, the SNP was such a seismic shift. It's like, what happened to Labour? It just collapsed. But then it was all Labour. And there's a decline there. It does go down and down. Picks up a little bit. And then there's quite a drop. In the second half of the 70s, the Catholic vote for Labour plummets to 1979. And what happens in 1979? It's Margaret Thatcher. So the Conservative vote, you can see among Catholics, from the mid-1970s goes right up to 79. So the Catholic vote, the one and only time Catholics voted more Conservative than Labour, was for Margaret Thatcher in 1979. And then the lines went their separate ways again. So the Catholic Labour vote picks up late 80s, and then early 90s, peaks again in 97, which of course is Tony Blair. And Tony Blair, not quite the heights of the 60s, but Blair got a lot of the Catholic vote. And the Conservative vote, the Catholic vote for Conservative drops and drops and drops. So there's a huge gulf again in there. And the Liberal vote is picking up all this time, ups and downs, but generally picking up compared to here. And that was the Liberals, now it's the Lib Dems here. And this is interesting, since 97, what's happening? The red line and the blue line, they're converging. And that convergence continues beyond 2010. So since then, and up now, the proportion of Catholics that vote Labour and Conservatives maps the national figures. There's no real difference. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, once we got into Q&A, we might want to explore this a bit. Do Catholics vote as Catholic? Or now we can maybe hold that for the Q&A, because I'm genuinely interested to hear what you've got to say about that. So how do we apply, and you put it beautifully earlier, how do we apply our conscience to vote? So we have, on the 4th of July, we go into the ballot box. Who do we vote for and why, if we're thinking about our faith and what our faith tells us? Well, let me introduce you to our dear friend. Remember Prudence? Dear Prudence, the virtues have gone out of fashion somewhat. Although actually, you know, they're coming back. A lot of our schools, again, are talking about virtue. There are people talking about virtue more. Prudence, the concept has been a little bit degraded, I think. With prudence, we think in terms of it's about being cautious and careful and not taking risks. Well, that's not the virtue of prudence. The virtue of prudence, which is the primary human virtue or cardinal virtue, okay? Prudence, remember, is the virtue that disposes reason to discern. Keyword. We're back to the catechism. To discern our true good in every circumstance, including who to vote for, and to choose the right means of achieving it. So that's prudence. Another, I was talking to my friend, where's he gone? At lunchtime about the young Christian workers, young Catholic workers. And the young Catholic workers, inspired by Cardinal Cardine, who was inspired by Aquinas. I mean, this is Aquinas, prudence, okay? So when Cardine, a Belgian priest, started to look at social issues, he devised a method of working out what to do. And he called it the See, Judge, Act method. Does that ring any bells? Yeah? If you're a religious order, you'll know about See, Judge, Act. If you've come up through the young Christian workers, you'll know about See, Judge, Act. It was somewhat quiet in the mainstream of the church through the 70s and 80s and 90s. I think, again, because it's probably associated with liberation theology and considered to be a little bit left-wing. But again, Pope Francis has brought it back front and centre, says, no, this is mainstream stuff. Where do we see Judge, Act in Catholic teaching? John the 23rd. His encyclical, remember that list of encyclicals I showed you? His encyclical of 1961, which is called Mater et Magistra, again, mother and teacher. In there, he says, this is how you apply Catholic social doctrine to your circumstances. You see what's going on as fully as you can. You discern, you ask yourself, what does the gospel tell us about this situation? And then you discern how to act. That is See, Judge, Act. That's prudence. It's the modern version of prudence. Okay? So this is what the church is asking us to do. Again, I think it's put very powerfully by Francis in Let Us Dream when he says, for this second step, so he's talking about discernment, and this is what we're called upon to do. How do we vote? We've got to discern how we use our vote. For this second step, we need not just openness to reality. So what's going on? What is going on around us? What do we see as fully as possible? But a robust set of criteria to guide us. That's Catholic social teaching and the gospel. Knowing we are loved by God, called to be a people in service and solidarity, we need to, and this is the bit we often skip, we need to a healthy capacity for silent reflection. And I think the synod process has reminded of us of silence and prayerful reflection. A lot of synod exercises I've been involved in start with silence and prayer, adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. Now we'll go and listen to each other. And I find that very powerful and very helpful. So a healthy capacity for silent reflection, places of refuge, I love this, from the tyranny of the urgent. The tyranny of the urgent. We are battered about, aren't we? By our diaries, by the pressures upon us, and we get a bit frazzled and a bit harassed. And he's saying, for goodness sake, try and make time away from the tyranny of the urgent. Most of all, we need prayer. To hear the prompts of the Spirit and cultivate dialogue in a community that can hold us and allow us to dream. Thus armed, we can read the signs of the times and opt for a way that does us all good. I find that very helpful. This is how to discern. We see what's happening around us as much as possible. We pray about it. We sit and we hold it in silence. We wait for the Spirit to prompt us and pull us in one direction to say, this is wrong. This is dehumanizing what you've just seen. This is humanizing. This is of God. This is not of God. This is of the gospel. This is not of the gospel. Or as Francis says, much more pithily, ideas are debated. Reality is discerned. Ideas are debated. Reality is discerned. Do you see the difference? So it's not a bun fight between, you know, the parish group arguing that this is right, this manifesto is better than this manifesto. I mean, there's room for debate, don't get me wrong. But he says before that, reality is discerned. We've got to try and, the picture's got to somehow click into focus. In other words, we need to see reality, let me put it this way, as God sees reality. Because our seeing, my seeing, is partial. I'm from that cultural background, that class background, that educational background, you know, that I've got a temperament. I see things through my perspective. Our perspectives are always partial, perhaps prejudiced, weighted, you know, for or against one group, you know. We see reality in a very kind of fragmented way. God sees reality kind of perfectly, if you like. Now, it's the work of a lifetime to even begin to see reality the way God sees it, but that's what we're called to do, to look upon reality with the compassionate gaze of the Father. So we'll just finish this bit with a few more thoughts from the common good, and then we'll see if we can go into some Q&A. So this Common Good 90, and this is on the Bishops' Conference website. You might have to dig a bit, but if you went to the publication section and scroll down and down and down, you'll find it from 96. Not that long ago, and this was produced for the 97 election as a guide for the Catholic community and how to vote. So if you're looking at how to inform your conscience, it's really helpful. So a few quotations from there. All Catholic citizens need, that's what you said, an informed social conscience that will enable them to identify and resist the structures of injustice in their own society. I don't think we use that language anymore. So I don't think the bishops use that language so much recently. I found this really powerful. Identify, resist the structures of injustice in our society. I find that stirring. I find that really helpful. And this, I think, is important. A general election must never be confused with a single issue referendum. Now, if that's stirring you up, just hold for, there's not much longer before we get a chance to debate, so don't worry. And I don't know in this, but certainly, dare I say, in America, there are certainly large groups of Catholics that think it's only about one issue. And it tends to be life issues, and by life issues, they tend to be talking about the beginning of life, or maybe the end of life. It's very much limited to that. That's it. That's it. And what the party says about one life issue determines how you vote. Well, that's not what our bishop said in 96. They said it must never be confused with a single issue referendum. So there is a life course. I mean, the church protects the dignity of the person from conception to the natural end of life. The church has always been a great promoter of life, the dignity of life and the sacredness of life throughout the life course. So from conception, early childhood, when you're sick, when you're young, when you're, you know, the whole life course. That's important. And then they say governments cannot be satisfied with provision for poor people designed only to present absolute poverty, such as actual starvation or physical homelessness. So it's not enough to create a safety net that just about keeps people alive. People should be able to live with some dignity. The thing about poverty is it reduces your agency. You know, we're hearing more and more the voice of lived experience, which I think is more and more important. The people who are actually trapped in different types of poverty, we're hearing their voices now, which we didn't do years ago. And when you hear it, it's very powerful. You know, the men and women who've got children, they say, I can't leave the house, I've got nothing to spend. I sit in the house so that I don't have to eat much. You know, and my kids, they get the food. I want to get them the uniform. I can't do anything with them. I've got no money. It's a very limited existence. And the slightest financial shock can knock people out of kilter. You know, the washing machine breaks down, you know, the slightest financial shock just knocks them for six. And that's when, what happens then? They need loan sharks. So they borrow £100 and they have to give back, take your pick, £200, £500. And then a spiral of debt and aggression and harassment, you know, and they get sucked into it more and more and more. And that's the reality for a lot of people in this country. So just a final signpost, that this is the first time I've been involved in any national organisation with a general election in the Catholic world. And I'm really impressed actually at how much is going on, how much energy there is, how much resource there is. This is just a sample, a small sample. I'll start with the Bishops' Conference website. If you go into their election page, there's a lot there. Not just recent statements, but a lot of documents through in recent years to help. This is us. Caritas Social Action Network has published a range of resources. We've got a general election statement. We've got a list of resources. We're producing lots of different things. We've got a big set of resources for Refugee Week, which is next week. CAFOD, you mentioned CAFOD and St Vincent de Paul Society. They've got something called the Year of Encounter, which is more about how to approach a hustings and some of the questions you might ask candidates when you engage with it. It's good stuff. And I'll just mention one more, the Centre for Catholic Social Thought and Practice based at Durham University. They've actually got a series of films. So if you're a visual learner, if your thing's watching rather than reading, then there's little films there. I've just watched a little film with Sister Margaret Atkins talking about subsidiarity. 15 minutes, great stuff, really, really powerful. The list goes on and on and on. The religious orders, because we've got a number of orders present here. We've got the Columbians, have produced some powerful stuff. The Jesuit missions have produced some good. So there's lots to help you with. And you think, well, that's a bit much, isn't it? Can't we just get one guide, one Catholic guide? Wouldn't that be much easier? Well, that's not really the church, is it? The church is full of charism and gifts and religious orders with a different charism, a different take, a different. So it's all there to help. And there might be something that you need that speaks to you more powerfully than the others. So it's all there. So at that point, I think it's time to have a little bit of, rather than say any questions, can I just suggest that we have a little chat among us? Because sometimes it might take a minute to formulate your question. If you're anything like me, I need time to process things. So you might have a half-formed question or challenge or comment or whatever it is. So give yourself time with your neighbour to formulate your reaction to what we've just said. What are you thinking? Do you have a question? Do you have a comment? Do you have a contribution? So a couple of minutes to talk about that, and then we'll just hear from the plenary. And I will keep an eye on the clock. And at 2 o'clock, I will say, thank you very much. We're done. Because you've got your shopping to do. You've got your grandkids to pick up. You've got your da-da-da. You've got your lives to get back to. And thank you, Father Adrian. The good people with us in the live stream. Again, thank you for joining us. If you're with someone, by all means, have the same conversation. If you're on your own, just reflect and contribute using the chat function. And Paul there behind the camera will gather your thoughts and share them with us. Thank you. So a little buzz, and then we'll hear. Is that okay? Then we'll hear your thoughts. Okay. So what do you think of all that?